There exists no force in nature quite so stubborn as a heart that refuses to acknowledge its own desires. Today, I bring you the most delightful tale of Miss Charlotte Weston and Viscount Nathaniel Grey, two souls who believed themselves masters of their own destiny, only to discover that Cupid cares not one whit for our carefully laid plans. But let us not rush, for the best love stories, like the finest wine, must be savored properly. Charlotte Weston possessed the sort of beauty that painters spend lifetimes attempting to capture. Golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, eyes the color of summer meadows, and a spirit that burned bright enough to illuminate the darkest ballroom. At 20, she had already refused 3 perfectly acceptable proposals, much to her dear mother's despair. The girl harbored romantic notions that would make even the most sentimental novelist blush. She spent her afternoons reading Gothic novels in her father's library, dreaming of mysterious strangers and passionate declarations beneath moonlit gardens. Marriage, she believed, should be the union of 2 hearts so perfectly matched that nothing, not fortune, not family pressure, not society's expectations, could keep them apart. Meanwhile, across London, Viscount Nathaniel Grey stood before his library window, surveying his estate papers with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for attending one's own funeral. At 8 and 20, he had grown weary of matchmaking mamas parading their simpering daughters before him like prize cattle at market. Love, he believed, was nothing more than a pleasant fiction invented by poets to sell their verses. His cynicism had been earned through bitter experience. At 5 and 20, he had fancied himself desperately in love with Lady Amelia Thornton, only to discover her in the arms of his closest friend mere days before their engagement was to be announced. The betrayal had crystallized his heart into something resembling granite, functional, enduring, but decidedly cold. The irony was not lost on me that these 2 determined souls, one desperately seeking love, the other adamantly avoiding it, would soon find their fates inexorably intertwined. The catalyst, as these things often are, proved to be financial necessity dressed up as family honor. Charlotte's father had made some rather unfortunate investments in a shipping venture that went down quite literally with all hands. The family faced the prospect of genteel poverty unless Charlotte could make an advantageous marriage. Similarly, Lord Grey's estate, while vast, carried debts that his late father's gambling habits had accumulated like autumn leaves. Marriage to an heiress would solve his problems entirely, whilst providing him with an heir to continue the family line, a transaction as neat and tidy as any business arrangement. When the lawyers suggested the match, both parties recoiled as if presented with a particularly unpleasant dose of medicine. Charlotte wept for 3 days at the destruction of her romantic dreams. Nathaniel consumed an entire bottle of his finest brandy whilst cursing the inconvenience of it all. Yet pride, that most stubborn of virtues, demanded they at least attempt to make the best of their circumstances. They would enter into a proper courtship, observe all the proprieties, and perhaps find enough compatibility to make their union bearable. How charmingly naive they both were. Their first meeting took place in the Weston drawing room on a particularly fine Tuesday afternoon. Charlotte had spent the morning pacing before her mirror, alternately pinching her cheeks for color and practicing expressions of polite indifference. She was determined to appear as unappealing as possible without being overtly rude. Lord Grey arrived precisely on time, because punctuality in such matters is both a virtue and a weapon. He had armed himself with prepared topics of conversation: the weather, the latest exhibition at Somerset House, perhaps a comment on the unusually mild spring. What he had not prepared for was the sight of Charlotte Weston attempting to look unattractive. She had chosen her most severe brown dress, scraped her glorious hair into a punishing knot, and adopted an expression that suggested she was suffering from acute indigestion. The effect was rather like watching someone try to dim the sun by holding up a handkerchief. For his part, Nathaniel had endeavored to appear as coldly formal as possible. He wore his darkest coat, maintained rigid posture, and kept his expression carefully neutral. One might have mistaken him for a particularly well-dressed statue, were it not for the telltale tightening around his eyes that betrayed his discomfort. The moment their eyes met across that modest drawing room, something extraordinary occurred. Charlotte's carefully constructed mask of indifference slipped just enough to reveal the intelligence blazing beneath, whilst Nathaniel's granite composure cracked to show the vulnerability he fought so hard to conceal. Mrs. Weston, bless her romantic soul, had conveniently discovered urgent business in the morning room, leaving them chaperoned only by a dozing aunt whose snores provided a rather unconventional musical accompaniment to their stilted conversation. They spoke of books, Charlotte professing to favor only the most improving volumes while secretly longing to discuss the thrilling novel she had hidden beneath her pillow. Nathaniel claimed to read nothing but agricultural treatises, whilst desperately wanting to quote the poetry that had once moved him to tears. Yet despite their mutual deception, something genuine began to emerge. When Charlotte forgot herself and launched into an impassioned defense of education for women, her eyes sparkled with such fire that Nathaniel found himself leaning forward despite his resolve. When he absently quoted a line from Byron before catching himself, Charlotte felt her pulse quicken at the unexpected glimpse of the man beneath the marble exterior. By the time he took his leave, both were thoroughly unsettled. Charlotte spent the remainder of the day telling herself that his gray eyes were perfectly ordinary, whilst Nathaniel rode through Hyde Park, wondering why he could not stop thinking about the way sunlight had caught in her hair. One must confess, watching two people fall in love whilst determinedly convincing themselves they were doing no such thing provided entertainment of the highest order. What followed was perhaps the most elaborate courtship of mutual denial ever witnessed in London society. They began meeting regularly, always properly chaperoned, always maintaining the fiction that this was merely a business arrangement requiring periodic negotiation. Their second encounter took place during the promenade hour in Hyde Park, where half of fashionable London could observe their careful choreography of indifference. Charlotte wore blue, not because it brought out her eyes, she assured herself, but because her other walking dress was at the modiste. Nathaniel had his curricle polished to perfection, purely for the sake of his horse's dignity, of course. The conversation proved marginally less stilted than their first meeting, though both remained committed to their roles as reluctant participants in this arranged courtship. They discussed the weather with the intensity of natural philosophers, debated the merits of various musical compositions as if the fate of nations hung in the balance, and managed to argue about literature with such passion that several matrons began whispering behind their fans. It was during one of these spirited debates concerning the relative merits of Miss Austen versus the Gothic novelists that Nathaniel made the grave error of laughing. Not the polite chuckle of social obligation, but genuine, delighted laughter at Charlotte's wickedly accurate impression of a swooning heroine. The sound transformed his entire countenance. Gone was the cold marble statue, replaced by a man of warmth and wit whose eyes crinkled most attractively at the corners. Charlotte found herself staring quite openly, her own careful composure forgotten in the face of this revelation. The moment stretched between them like a golden thread, heavy with possibility and fraught with danger. Then, as if simultaneously remembering their roles, both retreated behind their protective walls of propriety. But the damage was done. That laugh had revealed the man Charlotte could learn to love, whilst her unguarded response had shown Nathaniel a woman worth knowing. Their subsequent meetings became exercises in exquisite torture. They would sit in drawing rooms, maintaining proper distance whilst their eyes spoke volumes their lips dared not utter. They would walk through gardens, discussing roses and weather, whilst their hearts thundered with awareness of each other's presence. Society, naturally, began to take notice. The ton thrives on speculation, and the sight of the notorious Miss Weston, she who had refused 3 proposals, appearing to warm to the coldly perfect Viscount Grey, provided endless fodder for gossip. Lady Melbourne declared it the most sensible match of the season, whilst Mrs. Drummond Burrell sniffed that financial necessity made strange bedfellows indeed. The betting books at White's began taking wagers on whether the engagement would be announced before or after midsummer. Through it all, Charlotte and Nathaniel continued their careful dance of approach and retreat, each terrified of being the first to acknowledge what was growing between them. The turning point came during a visit to Hatchard's, that temple to literature where many a romance has bloomed between dusty shelves. Charlotte had escaped her mother's watchful eye for a brief moment to seek out the latest work by her favorite author, whilst Nathaniel had taken refuge from the crowds of Bond Street amongst the familiar comfort of books. They discovered each other in the poetry section, Charlotte reaching for a volume of Byron, Nathaniel holding a collection of Wordsworth. The irony was not lost on either of them that they should meet surrounded by the very sentiments they professed to disdain. But here, amongst the leather-bound volumes and filtered sunlight, their careful facades began to crumble. Charlotte admitted her secret passion for romantic verse, whilst Nathaniel confessed that poetry had once been his greatest pleasure before life taught him its dangers. They spoke of dreams deferred and hearts disappointed, of the fear that accompanies hope and the safety found in cynicism. For the first time since their acquaintance began, they were not Miss Weston and Lord Grey playing at courtship, but Charlotte and Nathaniel, two wounded souls recognizing kindred spirits. The moment when their hands brushed while reaching for the same volume felt like lightning striking. Neither pulled away immediately, instead allowing themselves this small transgression, this tiny rebellion against the careful boundaries they had constructed. Standing there in that shaft of golden afternoon light, surrounded by the words of poets who had dared to name love in all its glory and pain, they almost surrendered to the truth that blazed between them. Almost. Then Charlotte's maid appeared, bobbing anxious curtsies and reminding her mistress that Mrs. Weston was waiting in the carriage. The spell shattered like crystal, leaving them both shaken and more frightened than ever of what they were beginning to feel. But as Nathaniel watched her leave, he found himself purchasing the volume of Byron she had been reaching for, while Charlotte spent the carriage ride home clutching the Wordsworth she had absently picked up, her heart racing with the memory of his touch. That evening, both read poetry by candlelight and tried desperately to convince themselves that what was happening between them was merely physical attraction dressed up in romantic nonsense. They failed utterly. Just when it seemed these two stubborn souls might finally acknowledge their feelings, fate intervened in the form of Lady Amelia Thornton, the woman who had shattered Nathaniel's faith in love 3 years prior. She had returned from her wedding trip to the continent, more beautiful than ever, and apparently eager to renew old acquaintances. Her timing could not have been more perfectly calculated to cause maximum chaos. Charlotte first glimpsed them together at Lady Fairfax's soirée, where Amelia had cornered Nathaniel near the French doors leading to the garden. To Charlotte's inexperienced eye, their intimate conversation and Amelia's possessive touch on his arm suggested a reconciliation of the most romantic sort. What Charlotte could not see, what no one could see, was the carefully controlled fury in Nathaniel's eyes, or the way he repeatedly attempted to extricate himself from Amelia's web of manufactured intimacy. She saw only the tableau, the most beautiful woman in London making claim to the man Charlotte had, despite all her denials, begun to love. The pain was exquisite and immediate. Every carefully constructed wall around her heart crumbled in an instant, leaving her raw and exposed to the agony of jealousy. She fled the soirée with a hastily concocted headache, leaving Nathaniel to wonder at her sudden disappearance. His own misunderstanding came the following morning when he called at Brook Street, only to be informed by a triumphant Mrs. Weston that dear Charlotte was receiving Lord Pemberton in the morning room. Young Pemberton, it seemed, had renewed his suit with most encouraging results. The truth was far more mundane. Charlotte was attempting to convince the persistent young man that her affections were otherwise engaged, though she dared not name the object of those affections. But Nathaniel, wounded by what he perceived as Charlotte's fickleness, chose to interpret the scene through the lens of his own fears. Two people who had spent weeks learning to trust again retreated behind their familiar armor of cynicism and pride. Charlotte threw herself into encouraging Lord Pemberton's suit with desperate gaiety, whilst Nathaniel began appearing at social events, with Lady Amelia decorating his arm like a particularly beautiful parasite. Society was agog with speculation. Had the Grey Weston match collapsed before it truly began? Would there be 2 weddings, or none? The betting books at White's saw frantic activity as wagers were laid and changed daily. Through it all, both Charlotte and Nathaniel suffered the particular torment of the proud, watching the person they loved appear happy with another whilst maintaining a facade of complete indifference. It was a masterpiece of mutual misunderstanding, complicated by pride, seasoned with jealousy, and guaranteed to cause maximum suffering to all concerned. The truth, as it always does, emerged in the most dramatic fashion possible. The setting was Lady Jersey's ball, that glittering pinnacle of the London season where reputations were made and hearts were broken with equal frequency. Charlotte, resplendent in white silk and pearls, had just accepted Lord Pemberton's very public proposal when disaster struck in the form of Lady Amelia's melodramatic collapse. It seemed the beautiful widow had been overindulging in champagne and laudanum, a dangerous combination that left her unconscious on the ballroom floor. In the chaos that followed, private letters spilled from her reticule like fallen petals. Letters that revealed, in Amelia's own hand, the calculated nature of her pursuit of Nathaniel and her contempt for what she called his pathetic desire for a love match. The most damaging missive detailed her plan to ensnare him through manufactured intimacy and strategic positioning at social events, whilst privately mocking his romantic sensibilities to her confidants. She had not returned to London for love, but for revenge against the man who had dared to find her wanting. Nathaniel, reading these revelations with dawning horror, finally understood how thoroughly he had been manipulated. But the realization came too late. Charlotte was engaged to another, and he had no right to interfere with her happiness, even if it meant sacrificing his own. Meanwhile, Charlotte's engagement to Lord Pemberton was causing her own crisis of conscience. The young man deserved a wife who could love him completely, not one whose heart belonged irrevocably to another. The kindest thing, the only honorable thing, was to release him from their engagement despite the scandal it would cause. Both were prepared to sacrifice their own happiness for what they believed to be right. Charlotte would free Pemberton to find genuine love elsewhere, whilst Nathaniel would honor what he thought were her feelings for her new fiancé. The following day found Nathaniel alone in his library, surrounded by the leather-bound volumes that had once brought him comfort. In his hands lay the collection of Byron's poetry he had purchased that afternoon at Hatchard's, the very book Charlotte had been reaching for when their hands had touched and set his world ablaze. He opened it to a passage that seemed to mock his current desolation. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. The words that had once seemed merely pretty now cut through him like a blade, for they reminded him of Charlotte dancing in candlelight, her face alive with laughter he would never hear again. Setting the book aside with hands that trembled slightly, Nathaniel stared out at the garden where spring flowers bloomed in cheerful defiance of his misery. He had made his choice, or rather, he had allowed pride and fear to make it for him. Charlotte would marry Pemberton, bear him children, and live the comfortable life she deserved. And he would learn to content himself with the knowledge that she was happy, even if that happiness came at the cost of his own. It was a perfectly noble resolution, and it would have condemned them both to lives of quiet desperation, had not fate intervened in the form of one meddlesome elderly relative. It was a perfectly noble mess, and it took the intervention of an unlikely ally to untangle the web of misunderstanding that threatened to destroy them both. The unlikely ally proved to be Charlotte's elderly great-aunt Prudence, a formidable dame who had been observing the proceedings with the sharp eyes of one who had seen 8 decades of human folly. She had watched her great-niece pine for a man who clearly adored her, whilst that same man tortured himself with unnecessary nobility. Aunt Prudence had little patience for such romantic nonsense. On the night of Charlotte's engagement to Lord Pemberton, the old lady summoned both parties to her Mayfair mansion under separate pretenses, Charlotte to discuss her trousseau, Nathaniel to examine a painting she wished to sell. They arrived within moments of each other, only to find themselves locked in Aunt Prudence's conservatory, whilst that devious lady retired to her rooms with strict instructions to the servants that she was not to be disturbed until morning. Faced with spending the night together unchaperoned, a scandal that would require marriage to repair, they were forced to finally confront the truth that had been burning between them for months. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest either had ever engaged in. Charlotte confessed her terror of loving someone who could never return her feelings, whilst Nathaniel revealed his fear that offering his heart again would only lead to fresh betrayal. They spoke of dreams deferred and chances missed, of the courage required to choose love over safety, and the wisdom needed to recognize when love chooses you. As dawn approached, painting the conservatory in shades of rose and gold, they found themselves standing beneath the glass roof where stars had kept vigil over their reconciliation. The summer constellations wheeled overhead like celestial witnesses to what was about to unfold. Cassiopeia in her eternal chair, Ursa Major guarding the northern sky, and Venus blazing like a promise on the horizon. The conservatory itself seemed transformed by the approaching dawn. Exotic blooms perfumed the air with jasmine and orange blossom, whilst climbing roses wound around the iron framework created natural alcoves filled with morning light. It was a setting worthy of the most romantic of novels, though neither Charlotte nor Nathaniel was thinking of literature at that moment. Nathaniel spoke first, his voice rough with emotion and hours of honest conversation, as he confessed that he had fallen in love with her wit before her beauty, her spirit before her station, and her kindness before her fortune. He spoke of watching her gentle way with servants, her passion when discussing social injustices, and the light in her eyes when she debated literature. He told her how he had begun looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the pleasure of her company. He confessed that her laugh had become the sound he most wanted to hear, her smile the sight he most wanted to see, and her happiness the goal he most wanted to achieve. The words poured from him like water from a broken dam. All the feelings he had suppressed, all the admiration he had hidden, all the love he had been too proud and too frightened to acknowledge. He spoke of lying awake at night, thinking of things he wanted to show her, places he wanted to take her, conversations he wanted to share with her. Charlotte's response came not in words but in the way she stepped into his arms, finally allowing herself to trust in what she saw in his eyes. Her own confession tumbled out between tears of relief and joy. How she had fallen in love with his mind before his title, his hidden vulnerability before his public strength, and his capacity for growth before his social perfection. She told him about the books she had bought, hoping to discuss them with him, the poems that had reminded her of their conversations, and the empty feeling that had plagued her whenever they parted. She confessed that she had begun measuring every other man against him, and finding them all lacking. When he kissed her beneath those summer stars, it was with the reverence of a man who had found something he had never dared hope for, and the passion of a woman who had waited her entire life for this moment. The kiss was everything their careful courtship had denied them, desperate, tender, and filled with the promise of a lifetime of such moments. They remained in each other's arms as the sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, sharing soft kisses and softer words, planning a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. The scandal of their unchaperoned night together seemed insignificant compared to the joy of finally acknowledging what had been growing between them for months. The conservatory filled with birdsong as London awakened around them, though they barely noticed anything beyond the wonder of being held by the person they loved most in the world. They were discovered at dawn by Aunt Prudence's butler, who had been instructed to arrive with tea and congratulations at precisely the right moment. The scandal was immediate and complete, and entirely irrelevant, as the couple in question were far too busy planning their wedding to care what society might whisper. Lord Pemberton, that good-natured young man, released Charlotte from their engagement with obvious relief and genuine good wishes. Lady Amelia, faced with public exposure of her machinations, retreated to Bath, where she could recover her reputation amongst the invalid set. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the gardens of Nathaniel's estate, beneath the same summer stars that had witnessed their first true kiss. Charlotte wore her grandmother's pearls and a gown of ivory silk that caught the evening light like captured moonbeams. Nathaniel forgot his carefully prepared vows entirely and spoke instead from his heart about love that conquers fear and hope that triumphs over cynicism. As they danced their first waltz as husband and wife, surrounded by friends who had wagered variously on their success or failure, Charlotte whispered that she had finally found the love story she had always dreamed of, not in the pages of a Gothic novel, but in the arms of a man brave enough to risk his heart again. Nathaniel's response was lost to all but his bride, though those observant enough might have noticed the way she laughed and blushed and held him closer as the music swirled around them. And so, another tale reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, truly does conquer all. Pride, fear, misunderstanding, and even the interference of vindictive former mistresses. Charlotte and Nathaniel went on to enjoy 47 years of marriage, 6 children, and a love story that became legend amongst those privileged to witness its unfolding. They were buried side by side beneath a simple headstone that bore only their names and the dates of their birth and death, though those who knew them best understood that their true monument was the love they had built together, a love that began beneath summer stars and endured long after those same stars had wheeled through nearly half a century of seasons. Remember, gentle listeners, the greatest scandals often lead to the greatest happiness. True love may require courage, but it rewards that courage tenfold. Until we meet again, I remain your devoted chronicler, Lady Ravenswood.